Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to everybody. Good afternoon. I hope everyone is well. To everybody, our guests, our speakers, and everyone who's joining us today, it is my absolute pleasure and honor to welcome you to this webinar. Dialogue themed to Women and 20 Years of the African Union. The hope and the aim of today is to have an intergenerational reflection on the 20th anniversary of the transformation of the Organization of African Unity to the African Union, which is quite an apt conversation for us to be having, given that this year marks the 20th anniversary. Today we have we have speakers who will be speaking with us, and we'll have then a conversation. So I'd like to just go through the program for today quickly, and then we'll move on to, so Nigel, can you please just put up the program for us to see? So Nigel. So I hope you can see, everyone can see the program for us today. The Deputy Vice-Chancellor, I know it says they're the Vice-Chancellor, but today we are being joined by our Deputy Vice-Chancellor today, who will give us our official welcoming and just bring everyone up to speed about today. And then after that, the HOD of the Political and International Studies Department here at Rhodes, Dr. Siphokazi Magadla, will introduce our keynote speaker, the Honorable Minister, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma. Following her keynote address, we will then have a panel discussion facilitated by Busang, Senne, facilitated by Dr. Sithembile, Mbete. And then following that panel discussion, we will then have a question and answer session where we can then just engage. And then when we conclude, Dr. Magadla will give us the vote of thanks to conclude the program for today. And so for now, I am going to hand over to our Deputy Vice-Chancellor here at Rhodes University, Professor Mabukang Mabizela. Prof. Mabukang Mabizela is the first Black woman Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Academic and Student Affairs at Rhodes University. She began her academic career in the year 2000 at the University of the Free State Center for Higher Education Studies and Development, where she rose through the ranks from a research management intern to an associate professor. She was also at the Central University of Technology, where she served as a senior director at the Center for Innovation in Learning and Teaching, as well as Dean for Academic Development and Support. Her academic experience has also taken her to the United States, where she served as a visiting professor in the Executive Directorate in Education Administration program at the Seton Hall University in New Jersey, USA, where she taught a module on transformation and curriculum reform of education in Africa and South Africa. Professor Mabizela holds a PhD in higher education from the University of Free State. Other qualifications include a postgraduate diploma in higher education obtained from Rhodes University, which was awarded with exceptional distinction, both of which were obtained with distinction. Her first degree was a BSc Education, Biology and Chemistry, which she obtained from the University of Lesotho. Her interests include higher education policy, transformation, and teaching and learning. Prof. Mabizela has supervised and mentored many postgraduate students, mainly women, as well as presented scholarly papers at conferences nationally and internationally. She has published more than 25 research papers and chapters in scholarly books as part of her public service and engagement work. She has served on numerous national bodies, including the National Tertiary Retirement Fund, the Accreditation Committee of the Higher Education Qualification Committee of the Council of Higher Education, Umalusi Council for Quality Assurance, where she was also the Deputy Chairperson of Council and member of the Executive Committee of Council. So yeah, we are in very good hands here at Rhodes University with our Deputy Vice-Chancellor. Prof, I'd like to hand over to you now to give our welcoming remarks.
Program Ms. Tandokazi, Silosini, keynote speaker, Her Excellency Minister Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Ms. Mukondeleli, Mpeiwa, Head of the Mediation and Dialogue Division, African Union, Dr. Awino Okech, Associate Professor Politics and International Studies at SOAS, University of London, Rhodes University Leadership present, Professor Adele Moodley, our Registrar, and Professor Innocent Msindo, the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, all veteran leaders of the anti-apartheid struggle present here, Ambassador Tenjiwe Mtinto, Ambassador Naomi Ribbon Mushodi, members of the organizing team, Dr. Siphokazi Magadla, Head of Department of Political and International Studies at Rhodes University, and Dr. Babala Magodwana, Center for Women and Gender Studies, Nelson Mandela from the Center for Women and Gender Studies, Nelson Mandela University, Dr. Atabile Masola from Historical Studies, the University of Cape Town, and Dr. Sithembile Mbete, Political Sciences, University of Pretoria from University of Pretoria, and Dr. Kavaza Maluleke from the University of Cape Town Political Studies. Members of the community, academics and students across collaborating universities, Dumelang, Molweni, Sawubona, good afternoon. Rhodes University is delighted to be jointly hosting this intergenerational reflection on the 20th anniversary of the transformation of the Organization of African Unity to the African Union that happened in July 2002. It is fitting to look back at our achievements and the progress made to date in addressing key priorities of the African Union, especially those focusing on gender equality, development, and promotion of women empowerment. Our university, like all other higher education institutions, has a responsibility to advance the transformation and sustainability imperatives set out by government and the African Union. We therefore align and commit to the realization of the aspirations and intentions of the African Union Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. We align with aspirations for a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development through educating young minds. We believe that Africa's development and revival depends on well-educated and skilled citizens, especially women and children. Whilst progress can be noticed in many spheres, much work still remains in revolutionizing skills, science, and technology, in achieving full gender equality in all spheres of life and work, in strengthening the role of Africa's women through ensuring gender equality and parity in the political, economic, and social spheres, and in eliminating all forms of discrimination and violence against women and girls. And lastly, in ensuring that all women use their voice or voices to advance transformation. Universities have made great strides in providing access to women, although access in science, technology, engineering, and maths STEM programs is still dominated by males. At Rhodes University, over 60% of our student headcount are women. And over the last few years, the university has seen a steady increase in women graduates. In 2020, 66% of our graduates were women, while in 2021, 64% graduated. And we hope that these women go out or went out into the world to make a meaningful contribution in all spheres of life. And they played, or they continue to play, an active role in making Africa the Africa we all want. In relation to staff, we have also made some strides. We have been able to address equity at senior leadership positions, but we need to pay more attention to representation of women, especially Black women, in the professoriate levels and other positions of power. And I believe this could be the issue at other universities as well, and other spheres of work. In the last 2 years, our challenges were compounded by the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, which laid bare disparities between those who have and those who have not. COVID-19 further reversed some of the good progress that was hard-earned over the 20 years of the African Union. I'm sure you will agree that many children were left without parents and many could not go to school. Many people, including women, lost their jobs and were unable and continue to be unable to fend for their families. Working women struggled to maintain work-home balance. All sectors of education, including higher education, struggled to maintain continuity due to unavailability of resources and or perhaps due to our own short-sighted kind of planning. Security for women and children was highly compromised, while gender-based violence escalated, prompting our president, the Honorable Mr. Ramaphosa, to declare gender-based violence a second pandemic in the country. The 20th anniversary of the AU coincides with our review of our 5-year institutional development plan, which we have termed Mkombandlela, the campus, or paving the way, and our processes for reimagining our university for the next 5 to 10 years and beyond. Our new plan, which was guided by 4 important cross-cutting themes: quality and equity, digital transformation and innovation, impact, sustainability, deliberately and purposefully aligned with the National Development Plan 2030, the African Union's Agenda 2063, the Africa We Want, and the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, among other important plans. Through extensive consultations, we reflected on the success of the goals that we had set ourselves in 2018. In this new dispensation, we pledge our continued commitment to the transformation and sustainability agendas of the country and the AU priorities and aspirations. We pledge our continued commitment to educating young people and empowering children, both girls and boys, as well as women. It remains true that when you educate a child, you educate a village. When you empower a woman, you empower the whole world. And I want to add that we dare not leave the boy child behind. I believe it is through educating men that we could make strides in getting rid of some of the social ills, such as gender-based violence. Perhaps it is because I only have boys in my house. Honorable Minister Dlamini-Zuma, we are truly indebted to leaders like you who have for many years been contributing towards making this country a better place for all, for being a living example and model for young girls and women. And on behalf of Rhodes University, I welcome you, our Excellency Minister Dlamini-Zuma. I welcome the panelists and everyone else to this intergenerational dialogue about the future of African integration and the role of African women in achieving substantive Pan-African integration. We are looking forward to today's engagements. And once again, a big welcome to you all. And Nkosi Kelebu. I will now hand over to Dr. Siphokazi Magadla to introduce Her Excellency, Minister Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma.
Thank you to the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Mabukang Monapela Mapasela. Thank you to the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Sizwe Mabizela. And thank you to the Dean of Humanities, Professor Innocent Msindo, for their support in making this webinar possible. This intergenerational gathering is a result of a collaboration between feminist scholars in 4 universities. It is part of an ongoing collaboration between the Political and International Studies Department at Rhodes University, the Center for Women and Gender Studies at Nelson Mandela University, Historical and Political Studies at the University of Cape Town, and the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria, that seeks to foster feminist collaboration in higher education, center gender equity, excavate women's biographical, intellectual histories, and provide a coordinated fight against gender-based violence in the higher education sector. I would like to say thanks to peers and collaborators, Dr. Babaloma Goqwana of Nelson Mandela University, Dr. Atambila Masola of the University of Cape Town, Dr. Sithembile Mbete of the University of Pretoria, and Dr. Gabaza Maluleke of the University of Cape Town. Thank you too to the students from Rhodes University, Nelson Mandela University, and the University of Cape Town, Tandokazi Silosini, Kanya Benz Ngamashe, Nompumelelo Babeli, Busang Senne, Hanashe Mufokari, Hauhelo Mkumbeni, Nigel Machiha, Ofense Make, Okuhle Botwana, and Siphokazi Tau. Thank you too to the administrators at Rhodes University and Nelson Mandela University, Sibulele Duba and Wendy Adams. Thank you to Charmaine Avery, the conference and events manager at Rhodes University. Thank you too to Minister Dlamini-Zuma's team at the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Mandi Sambele, Matom Shongo, Neliswa Chilowane, Gani Mchizo, Boyani Mpasha, Lehadima Leso, and Lungi Mchali. I would like to also acknowledge the presence of Professor Sibagrovagui of Cornell University, who served as our Nelson Mandela visiting professor at Rhodes University. I would like to also acknowledge the presence of Professor Nkiru Nzengu of Binghamton University, who will join us in 2023 as the Nelson Mandela visiting professor. Thank you to the first-year students that are present here. We are an audience of 198 as we speak. These first-year students who are with us today are being taught by Professor Sally Matthews. The students might be happy to know that one of our panelists, Mukondeleli Mpeiwa, was once a student of Professor Matthews at the University of Pretoria. Thank you too to the third-year students that are being taught by Dr. Thapelo Tselapedi. The average first-year student in this room was born in 2004, 2 years after the founding of the African Union. Most of the third years were born in 2002. For this generation, the transformation of the Organization of African Unity to the African Union is a historical event. Whereas for some of us, we remember the excitement, the hope, the visions of this time as Africans were committing to each other to make the 21st century Africa's century of substantive self-determination and collective prosperity. We revisit this moment to take stock of what has been achieved in the past 20 years. We are lucky to be able to do so with an elder whose expansive vision, strategies, tactics, and forms of organizing have informed the very foundation of the African Union. Minister Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma was born in Pietermaritzburg in 1949 in KwaZulu-Natal. She completed her high school studies at Amanzimtoti Training College in 1967. After a 4-year gap, she started her studies in zoology and botany at the University of Zululand in 1971. She obtained a BSc degree and was in her 5th year of her medical studies at the University of Natal when she escaped South Africa and went into exile in September 1976. Nika Cornell explains in her dissertation about Minister Dlamini-Zuma's years in exile that, and I quote, while her departure coincided with the events following the Soweto uprisings, this was not her reason for leaving, end quote. She explains that as an active member of the ANC underground and a deputy president of the South African Student Organization, SASO, the police were after her. She explains that what she feared the most was that the police would try and turn her into a state nurse, which she would have hated more than being charged. So she left South Africa. In her 14 years in exile, 1976 to 1990, she completed her medical studies at the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom in 1978. She served in the ANC underground, worked as a pediatric medical officer in Swaziland, and served in the ANC's Health Committee and established the Health and Refugee Trust, HAT, which was the only organization set up specifically to supply medical provisions to South African refugees. The images that are being shown are from Cornell's research about Minister Dlamini-Zuma. In 1994, Minister Dlamini-Zuma became South Africa's first Minister of Health. In 1999, she became the Minister of Foreign Affairs. It was in this capacity as the Minister of Foreign Affairs that she played a central role in the transformation of the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. Justice Malala describes her, and I quote, as the nuts and bolts woman, the one who got the paperwork signed, sealed, and delivered behind the scenes. Mokgotsi too notes, and I quote, that the no-nonsense, business-like, tough manner with which she chaired and conducted deliberations is still referred to with admiration by many diplomats across the African continent. For example, at the 2003 African Union Summit, during a marathon session to get the adoption of the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and the Rights of Women of Africa, who's through the agenda, Lizelot van Ron recalls a West African foreign minister telling her, your foreign minister doesn't take no for an answer. In July 2012, Minister Dlamini-Zuma was elected as the chairperson of the African Union Commission by the heads of states in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. She was the first woman to lead the Continental Organization, including its predecessor, the Organization of African Unity. She pioneered the 2013 adoption of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. Agenda 2063 provides a blueprint about how Africa can achieve self-determination, freedom, progress, and collective prosperity by 2063. As Simon Allison points out, Agenda 2063, I quote, bears the stamp of her ideological preoccupations from gender rights to Pan-Africanism to the unflinching emphasis on continental integration, end quote. Minister Dlamini-Zuma's legacy shows that African integration goes hand in hand with the achievement of gender equality. In a context where we see the entrenchment of a phallocracy in African politics, to use a winner-or-catch term, we must wonder if current generations of women and feminists are not seeing the undoing of this legacy. Finally, last year, when we had a dialogue about the 25th year anniversary of the Beijing conference, Ambassador Thenjiwe Mdidzo and Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka referred to the Beijing conference as Umcimbi wase Beijing. Today, we would like to welcome you, Minister, kulo mcimbi wabafazi nomanyano lama Africa. We welcome you, Dlamini, Sibalukhulu, Gonyama. Thank you.
Hey, ngiyabulela kakhulu. Thank you very much, and I would like to greet you all. Starting with the chairperson of the session, Mr. Silosini, Vice-Chancellor of Rhodes University, Professor Sizwe Mabizela, fellow panelists, Dr. Adwa Akej, Dr. Sithembile Mbete, and Ms. Mukondeleli Mpeiwa. Members of the academia from Rhodes, Nelson Mandela University, University of Cape Town, University of Pretoria, as well as those who join us from beyond. And I heard that Ambassador Mtinto is also here. Members of the Students' Representative Council and student bodies, researchers, and members of the Fourth Estate. I don't know whether you were also saying Deputy President Mlambo-Ngcuka is here. If she is, greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for this invitation to address this August Intergenerational Forum, which seeks to take stock of progress in relation to women's empowerment since the Durban launch in July 2002. I should also note that you host this session as we mark 45 years and 3 days since the brutal murder of Stephen Bantu Biko. Allow me to pause and recognize the reconciliation efforts and the gesture extended by the University Council and administration in remaining what they CAF as the Bantu Stephen Biko building. The sports, recreation, and entertainment facilities, as well as student media, the SRC, clubs, study halls, computer centers, student societies, and the bars of student activities, they are a fitting tribute to a man who lived life to the fullest and was larger than life itself. We're also pleased to see the names of our heroes feature prominently on your halls and residences. That most of them are named after women is also a reason to celebrate. Names carry with them great sentimental and aspirational values, which serve as important nation-building ingredients that foster a sense of belonging. Program Director, that you also host this Festival of Ideas during our Heritage Month is a great reminder of where we come from. Once again, it reminds us of Steve Biko, who reminded us that the greatest weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Thus, he concludes that the Black person, I quote, must reject all value systems that seek to make him or her a foreigner in the country of his or her birth and reduce his or her basic human dignity, close quote. Essentially, his call was a call for us to return to our values of Ubuntu. In South Africa, the departure from our African value system began on the 3rd of February in 1488, when the barking dogs of the headsmen in Mossel Bay spotted the vessels of the crew of the Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias. Then, I quote, quite suddenly a shadow fell on the world, and the sun seemed hidden behind a thick cloud, to quote Chino Achebe in Things Fall Apart. That history and its consequences are well known to all of us here and on the continent. To use Achebe's analogy again, quote, at first, a fairly small swarm came. they were the Hamijas sent to survey the land, and then appeared on the horizon a slowly moving mass like a boundless sheet of black cloud. Soon it covered half the sky, and the solid mass was now broken by tiny eyes of light like shining stardust. He concludes that at last the locusts did descend. They settled on every tree and on every blade of grass. They settled on the roofs and covered the bare ground. The mighty tree branches broke away under them, and the whole country became the brown earth color of the vast, hungry swamp, close quote. This led to centuries of resistance and wars, including Makanda's battle for Grahamstown in 1818 to 1819, which was the fifth of the 9 Xhosa wars, which lasted a century. It was also the last of the 15 Kwena and Son wars of resistance in the Cape. Of great significance was the history records that these earlier wars were led by chiefs and traditional leaders. The roles of great women warriors and nation builders such as Queen Mtania, Princess Mkabayi, Priestess Matumba have been erased. We will therefore look to institutions like Rhodes and those that are part of these events organizing team to reinsert them back into history. Also of relevance is that in recognizing the instrumental role of women in the struggle, the white administration framed women as minors. This allowed the colonial master to manipulate customary law by infusing Western patriarchal concepts. Pan-Africanist Thomas Sankara reminds us that, I quote, "Humankind first knew slavery with the advent of private property. Man, master of his slaves and of the land, also became the owner of the women. For this was the great historic defeat of the female sex," close quote. In the African context, with colonization, for Sankara and Africans, it meant, quote, paternal right replaced maternal right. Property was now handed from father to son, rather than as before, from women to clan. The patriarchal made its appearance, founded on the soul and personal property of the father, who became the head of the family. Reigning supreme, the man satisfied his sexual whims by mating with his slaves or concubines, close quote. This is not to say the African cultural system at the time had no patriarchal undertones, but no doubt the colonial power accelerated the oppression of women even further. Thus, by the time the infamous 1913 Land Act came, African women had no security of tenure and could not inherit any property nor enter any form of contractual arrangements. Added to this was the enforcement of several taxes, which enabled apartheid migration patterns to find roots. The colonial and apartheid system particularly placed a heavier burden and limitations on African women. This was partially because they initially sought to reserve certain urban jobs, categories such as secretarial jobs and domestic work, to poorer white women. In fact, the imposition of pass laws led to the very first anti-pass march in 1913, which was led by women. This, together with the suppression of African culture, further closing of the few economic opportunities and sexism, amongst others, was also at the center of the Second Women's March. That march took place October 1955, a year before the famous 9 August 1956 march to the Union Building. The second march attracted 2,000 women approximately to the Union building, and many were jailed. As we all know, the third march also to the Union buildings saw over 20,000 women confronting the regime at their very seat of power. Despite their courage and magnitude marches, other women-led initiatives, they are not sufficiently captured in our history. Take, for instance, the role played by Professor Margaret Ballinger, who was a history lecturer in this very university. She was also an organizer in the 1955 and 56 women's marches. She was at the forefront of global solidarity and initiated the formation of the Liberal Society of the Friends of Africa in 1934 and the Association of European and African Women in 1936. She went on to represent the people of the Eastern Cape on the Native Representative Council for over 20 years. Writing her tribute, O.D. Holheim said, I quote, "For 23 of her 86 years, Margaret Ballinger sat stoically and heroically through 6 months of every year in Parliament, having to endure abuse, calumny, distortion of her words, and often venomous attacks on her personality," close quotes. We therefore welcome the long-term objectives of this forum, which in part include the excavation of women's biographical intellectual histories. We take this opportunity to pledge our support to this important initiative. It is the contribution of such women and many other courageous African women that saw the formation of the Pan-African Women's Organization, PAW. This was the first Pan-African organization on the continent, which was formed in 1962 in Arusha, Tanzania. The formation of PAW and the courage of that generation of women permanently changed the liberation landscape. It was Afro-American author Maya Angelou who reminded us that, I quote, "Courage is the most important of all the virtues, because without courage, you cannot practice any other virtue consistently. You can practice many virtues erratically, but nothing consistently without courage," close quote. Thus, we can only describe the women of that generation as courageous. They also united women from all corners of our continent to realize emancipation of Africans. It was PAW which spurred on the Organization of African Unity against all odds to push for the UN resolution 2202 in 1966, which recognized apartheid as a crime against humanity. This contribution of these women to the struggle was recognized by the United Nations in reviewing the first UN decade for women, which spanned between 1975 and 1985. In their review document, they said, "Many women of South Africa and Namibia have risen with determination, courage, and heroism to resist and fight apartheid alongside men in a bitter struggle which intensified within the period of the United Nations decades for women," close quote. This was echoed by President of the African National Congress in his 1981 address to the ANC Women's Section, wherein he said, I quote, We have thus dedicated this coming year as confirmation of the resolve of the South African National Liberation Movement to see the women of our motherland play their rightful role in the forefront of the struggle for the destruction of the monstrous system of apartheid and the creation of a peaceful, democratic, non-racial South Africa. Again, despite these immense contributions, the history and contribution of women continues to be but a footnote of our continental history. Nonetheless, in paying tribute to our heroes and heroines, and in launching the AU in 2002 in Durban, President Thabo Mbeki reminded us that, I quote, 39 years after the Organization of African Unity was formed in Addis Ababa, in the ancient African state of Ethiopia, Africa has convened in Durban to decide what it should do about itself. To answer this question, Africans have adopted the Constitutive Act of the African Union, which defines clearly the common objectives we as Africans have committed ourselves to and the tasks that lie ahead of us. The Constitutive Act is the supreme law of the continent. He concludes that one of the key objectives of the Constitutive Act is to rededicate ourselves to those fundamental principles we have adopted of human and people's rights, of gender equality, of workers' rights, and the right of the child. Close quotes. Thus, one of the first decisions taken by the 2002 Durban Summit was the decision to attain gender parity in the Union. This was followed up by several instruments and decisions directed at women's empowerment and the ending of gender-based violence. These have included the 2002 Maputo Protocol on the African Charter of Human and People's Rights and the Rights of Women. 2, the 2004 Solemn Declaration on Gender Equality in Africa. And 3, the 2013 OAU 50th Anniversary Solemn Declaration. These, amongst others, establish the principles of women's rights as human rights, gender parity, and establish institutional funding mechanisms such as the Fund for African Women. All these are based on the international instruments on human and women's rights, including the Beijing Platform for Action 1995, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women 1979, and the UN Resolution 1325-2000 on Women, Peace and Security. Program Director, we have set this detailed context so that we can better understand where we come from. This will empower us to grasp the challenges in evaluating where we should be in relation to the implementation of the African Women's Decade 2010-2020. Critical in this understanding is that in the history of the OAU-AU, there has never been an overarching long-range plan which allowed the continent to free itself from its constraints. Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, with its 7 aspirations, the first 10-year implementation plan and the 12 flagship projects reimagines an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, driven by its own citizens, representing a dynamic force in the global arena. Most important to today's discussion, the plan is anchored on a strong cultural identity that is based on the development, is people-driven, relying on the potential of African people, especially its women and youth. This is the overarching context in which we will all evaluate the 10 critical action areas for the African Women's Decade. Obviously, each of the 10 areas can be subjected to a main address in themselves. We'll attempt to provide a cursory overview of some of the points with a view of ascertaining progress, challenges, and the way forward. As we have said, one of the first decisions of the AU, which also made its way into the 10 action areas of the decade, is a matter of women in decision-making. Since the inception of the AU, no women has chaired the Assembly, which is the highest decision-making body of the Union. Of course, this is a function of both structure and electoral outcomes of the continent, because only a head of state of government can chair the Assembly. In the 62 years of the OAU and 20 years of the AU, there's only been one head of state or government who emerged directly from the polls, and that is President Ellen Sirleaf Johnson of Liberia. Granted, in 1993, the Sylvia Kiningi took the initiative to act as president of Burundi in 1993, but never attended the OAU summit in that capacity. In the years 2012 and 2014, President Sirleaf was joined by President Joyce Banda of Malawi and Agnes Senne of Mauritius, both of whom took over terms of other presidents. In 2014, Banda's term came to an end, and Catherine Samba Panza of CAR joined the trio, albeit in an acting capacity. For a moment, we thought there was hope and light at the end of the tunnel, but it was not to be. Most recently, Mesale Wok Zewde of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia and Mesamia Suluhu Hassan of the United Republic of Tanzania became heads of state, and they are the only women at that level. Only Madam Hassan of Tanzania attends the AU meetings, since the head of government in Ethiopia is the one charged with dealing with matters of state and international relations. The next level is the Council of Ministers, which is usually constituted by ministers responsible for international relations. On occasion, at that level, there have been female chairpersons, but women have never been anywhere near 50% of the constituents of that body. Members of the council, ministers, are also products of the political systems. Thus, we must pay attention to the slow pace in relation to reaching the 30% by 2023 threshold of women in parliament, regional and local bodies. Currently, the continent stands at 27.6%, up from 21% in 2013. Only 16 member states have surpassed the 30% threshold. A further 29 are on track to meet that goal by next year, and 10 nations, mainly in West Africa and North Africa, may not meet the goal unless drastic actions are taken. Perhaps we need to advocate for accelerated nation-level action, as has been the case in countries such as Algeria, Benin, Cameroon, Comoros, Congo, Djibouti, DRC, Kenya, Niger, Rwanda, Senegal, and Togo, where they have put in place constitutional and legal provisions to enforce gender parity in executives, legislative, and judicial branches, as well as political party rosters and across the public sector. Program director, it was initially similar at the Commission, agencies, and AU institution level. Through concerted actions, we were able to gradually transform and influence decisions at the Assembly, Council, and Commission levels. Thus, when it came to employing staff, we enforced the gender rule. Where we were told there were no women, we searched for them. And when we got 50% men, we then said the first qualifying, experienced, and shortlisted women would enter. At the political level, we convened intergenerational and women's pre-summit dialogues so that we could ensure that all decisions had the voice of young women. Small as were these measures, the returns were huge. For instance, whereas there was not recorded history or art of power, today the institution is an agency of the AU. And should you attend a summit in Addis, you will find a painting recognizing the founding mothers as the core of the Pan-Africanism and the AU. Today, 50% of the political leadership of the Commission is exactly 50-50, and it is unlikely that this gain will be reversed. However, ultimately, we must be able to find women leaders in all areas of human endeavor, in and outside government and the state. For instance, Africa.com surveyed 1,364 companies listed on the 24 African stock exchanges. It found that there were only 35 female CEOs. Virtually in every economic sector, there is women underrepresentation, especially in leadership. This, despite research proving that women inclusive and led companies outperform male-led companies. The Africa CEO Forum reports that business on the continent with the most women on their boards have an operating profit over 20% higher than industry averages. The future of Africa is hinged on a prosperous continent based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. And that must include women. Therefore, in fighting poverty, we must promote the transformation of our economies so that they are not solely based on resource extraction and the exporting of raw materials. They must also offer equal opportunities to all, regardless of race, class, and gender. Thus, the promotion of economic empowerment of women and the securing of opportunities is cardinal to sustained narrative of a rising Africa. Africa won't rise if women don't. To achieve this, we must expand our economies beyond the current frontiers and sectors, whilst also providing opportunities in existing sectors. Consequently, Agenda 2063 identifies new frontiers such as the oceans economy as an area in which sustainable and inclusive economies could be grown. Further, the agenda identifies agriculture, tourism, ICT, infrastructure, and the Africa Continental Free Trade Area as potential areas in which existing and new initiatives can be expanded. With regards to trade, the continent is on track. It has achieved 84% of its 2021 targets towards free continental free trade. Already, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement has been signed by 54 AU member states and 43 ratified the agreement. Unfortunately, the date of trade within the AfCFTA had been set for January 2021, but due to COVID-19 pandemic, this has been revised. Nonetheless, several member states have signed several bills to domesticate the agreement. These include bills of origin and also eliminating non-tariff barriers, thus increasing the ease of movement of goods and persons whilst reducing the cost of trading across the borders. These efforts would greatly be complemented by the implementation of the Africa Passport by the member states. Already, such regional passports are available in ECOWAS and the EAC. We have also recently seen Botswana and Namibia enter agreements which will allow their citizens to move freely between their countries, utilizing their ID documents, which, by the way, should be similar in most of SADC countries. on the surface, this may look like a matter that stands to benefit only state parties and big business. But the reality is that currently 40% of inter-Africa trade is informal trade, in which 90% of informal cross-border traders are women. It will therefore be impossible to reach the AFCFTA 2045 goal of 50% intra-Africa trade without women. We must therefore pay particular attention to the safety and health conditions in which these women trade under, as they are often threatened by law enforcement officers as well as human and illicit trade traffickers. They also have no access to financing and credit, which means they may forever be confined to small and informal traders, despite their courage, true potential, innovations, and ingenuity. According to the IMF, only 37% of women in Africa have a bank account compared to 48% men. This gap has only widened over the past several years. Additionally, credit rationing through high interest rates disproportionately discourages women entrepreneurs from applying for loans. This gender gap in financing has dramatic consequences. Take the female-dominated fashion industry, which generates $31 billion per annum. The women's small and medium industries are interconnected through the supply and retail value chains. Without access to financing, the enterprises continuously suffer and cannot tap into higher value areas of the fashion industry and export markets. We therefore look forward to the outcomes of the conference on women and youth in trade, which concluded yesterday and was hosted by the AFCFTA Secretariat and the government of Tanzania. No doubt, the outcomes of that conference will also stand to fuel the financing initiatives already undertaken in the context of the African Union Decade on Women's Financial and Economic Inclusion 2020-2030. Already, through the partnership framework, about $100 billion US can be unlocked to support about 10 million African women and youth entrepreneurs. This will also complement the work already begun by the African Development Bank, which has set aside $300 million US to leverage $3 billion US by 2025 for financial and non-financial services for women in business. The extension of this support will also require domestic funding and finances. Unfortunately, according to the African Union report on the implementation of African Women Decade, gender still accounts for 2% or less of national budgets, and gender-responsive budgeting is considered a competing priority to economic recovery shocks from such as the COVID-related recession. Yet evidence shows that the brunt of poverty, inequality, pandemics, disasters, recession, and other shocks are borne by women and girls. Therefore, non-gender responsive budgeting is more likely to be inadequate in sustainability, quantum, depth, and impact. Perhaps it is time to employ measures such as the one employed in Uganda in all member states. In a recent symposium we hosted, that government told us that Ugandan ministries had to obtain a certificate from the Equal Opportunities Commission to verify their budget and plans and make sure that their budgets are gender responsive, without which certificate the ministry budget would not be approved by the legislature and treasury. The sad reality is that most governments, including the South African government, do not have sufficient capacity and expertise to deliver on a gender responsive budgeting. But of course, they can find those expertise. nor do they have the repositories of data and information to track and advise on appropriate gender responsive plans and budget allocations. We take this opportunity to invite the institutions here gathered and beyond to partner with us, training institutions such as the National School of Governance to deliver modules and simulation exercises that can favor our local, provincial, and national governments with such capacities. Additional to that, the private sector will have to join the party. This, in our context, will require more equitable ownership patterns and the transformation of the financing and banking sector. Despite being the second populous continent on the world, Africa has the least number of commercial banks, with 763 commercial banks. In contrast, Asia has at least 1,900, the EU has about 6,000, while the US alone has 4,000. The highest number of commercial banks are in Kenya, which has 39 banks, where only 5 have female CEOs. Not only must we expand the commercial bank spaces, but we must complement them with localized but connected banks such as cooperatives and municipal banks. With the advent of fintech, Africa can leapfrog and close the gap, as apps like M-Pesa have shown. However, careful attention must be paid to the digital gender gap as well as the rural-urban divide. Program Director, as anticipated by Agenda 2063, all these and other opportunities we speak of require well-educated citizens and a skills revolution. This must be biased in favor of women and youth and should be underpinned by science, technology, and innovation. There are many dimensions to the important area, from early learning to research, training, and development, as well as the gender, class, and racial imbalances in the academia. In the interest of time, and in line with this conversation, I wish to isolate myself to research conducted on behalf of the AU by the Africa Capacity Building Foundation back in 2016. The research considered the critical technical skills required to deliver on the first 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063 and its flagship projects. The report concludes that, I quote, "Alarms should be sounding over the death of critical technical skills in Africa," close quote. The report considered over 100 critical skills required to deliver on Agenda 2063. And at the time, in part said, Africa now lacks an estimated 8,172 medical doctors and specialists, and should aim to have 9,503,000 by 2023. Africa is short of an estimated 1,168,571 researchers and should aim to have 1,405,300 by 2023. The continent currently lacks an estimated 4,309,065 engineers and should aim to have 4,865,270 in 2023. It is short of 382,127 quantity surveyors and should be aiming at having 456,534 by 2023. Here comes the challenge. To our knowledge, this research has not been updated, nor has it been broken into gender. This forum we address today sets as one of its objectives as seeking to foster a feminist collaboration in higher education and center gender equity. We believe that the project of updating the research whilst collaborating with training institutions such as TVETs and community colleges throughout the continent is a necessary step, change required. Like our forebearers, we must recognize that our true economic liberation and change of fortunes is intertwined within the destiny of Africa. It is not only when we realize unity in action and purpose that we can truly liberate our continent and realize an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the international arena. For that we must have the courage so that, like Mabizela Mandela, we can say, I'm not sorry, I will never be sorry. I would do everything I did again if I had to. Everything. As we live up to Steve Biko's expectations to bestow on Africa the greatest possible gift, a more humane face. And lastly, as I conclude, I just want to say, let's start a campaign to stop the practice of paying women less for work of similar value. We must make it illegal to do that. I thank you.
Good afternoon to our esteemed guests and speakers joining us today from across the continent and internationally. And a heartfelt thank you to Minister Dlamini-Zuma for that illuminating reflection on our collective history as a continent and for powerfully touching on the crucial and diverse role of women in realizing the African Union's vision over the last 20 years and beyond. Thank you, Honorable Minister, for giving us all some important considerations involving women's empowerment and participation in the AU going forward. My name is Busang Senne from the Department of Political Studies at the University of Cape Town, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sithembile Mbete as our facilitator for the panel discussion this afternoon. Dr. Mbete is the Director of Programs of Future Elect, the nonprofit and nonpartisan political training program for emerging public leaders in Southern Africa. She is a tenured senior lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria, where she teaches international relations and South African politics. Thank you, and I will hand over to you, Dr. Mbete.
Thank you so much, Busang, and thank you everyone for having me here. A huge thank you, Honourable Minister, for that excellent discussion, for that excellent intervention on not just the history of the African Union over the last 20 years, but for really grounding it in the collective history of Africans over the last 600 or 700 years, and really rooting it in the contribution of women, the immense contribution of women in the continent's history of anti-colonial struggle and in the development of the key governance organizations on the continent over the past century. I think that we so often speak about African continental integration efforts as recent, or as events, as movements over the last 70 years, but really you brought it right back to our collective history, and I think that was really important for locating us and for contextualizing why we are here. I think it was also really important to write back into history the roles of women in all of these movements against colonialism, or the movements for continental integration. And as you said, writing those histories is really critical, and I'm glad that we've got so many students online, that we can perhaps pass the mantle on to you to say, these are the stories that really need to be written as we get to know more about ourselves and as we chart our future. I'm really honored today to be moderating and facilitating the panel discussion. I'd like to introduce our panelists today who will be joining Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma on the panel to discuss these issues today. The first person I'd like to introduce is Dr. Awino Okech, who is an Associate Professor in Politics and International Studies at SOAS, University of London. Her teaching and research interests lie in the nexus between gender, sexuality, security, and nation-state making projects as they occur in conflict and post-conflict societies. Before joining SOAS, she worked for over a decade in the development sector across various sub-regions in Africa, supporting women's rights organizations and local movements working at the intersection of gender and conflict. This work remains central to her scholarship and teaching and is illustrated in ongoing support to feminist social justice movements in Africa and feminist movement building organizations globally. At SOAS, Dr. Okech's work is split between teaching the Department of Politics and International Studies and supporting the delivery of SOAS's racial justice commitments as Associate Director, Equity and Accountability. It is a great pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. And then I would like to introduce Ms. Mukondeleli Mpeiwa, who is currently the head of the Mediation and Dialogue Division within the Political Affairs, Peace and Security Department of the African Union Commission. Prior to assuming this role, Mukondeleli was the coordinator of the Panel of the Wise, FemWise Africa Secretariat, and a senior policy officer in the AU Mediation Support Unit. She has vast experience in the peace and security space, having worked in migration, mediation, and conflict prevention over 15 years. Prior to joining the African Union, she worked in the SADC Secretariat's Mediation Support Unit and has previously worked with the International Organization for Migration as a founding head of mission in Botswana and in other capacities in their East and Southern African regional offices. She also worked for South Africa's National Treasury in the international finance and development field, as well as the Department for International Relations and Cooperation, where she started her career in 2006. Thank you so much for joining us and for giving us a perspective as somebody who is working currently in the African Union, in the African Union Commission. So thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to start with you, Dr. Okech. We heard from Dr. Magadla just now that the majority of the students, the first years, most of them being born in 2004, most of the third years being born in 2002. And for such young people, the magnitude of the formation of the African Union I think isn't always captured in the literature that we set in our different classes, that the decision to transform the OAU into the AU that was made in 1999 was in many ways a time of excitement, of optimism, with all of the debates, the visionary thinking and a lot of hard work actually that went in it. Can you give us a sense from your perspective, and especially with the kind of work that you have done in your career, about the social and political atmosphere and the ideas and the hopes of this time as Africans were making a renewed commitment towards African unity? Can you just give us a sense of what the hopes were for the formation of the African Union?
Thank you so much, Sithembile, and Siphokazi also for the invitation to speak as part of this panel. And of course, it's always a great pleasure to hear Dr. Zuma speak. I think you are very right that the shift to the African Union presented a particular political and social moment on the African continent. I think if I think about the Organization of African Unity and its founding at a moment when I was not born, and what the AU represented in terms of its re-imbuing the OAU with a sort of new vision was three things. The first is that we saw a very strong engagement of civil society organizations. I would argue, having not been present in the 1960s, that with the AU, we saw a deeper engagement of citizens, nationals, and the ordinary mwananchi, as Kenyans would say, deeply engaged in what it meant to build continental unity. That, for me, is a significant shift because it creates ownership in the African Union. It creates a sense that citizens see a stake in the idea of continental unity and a reclamation of the Pan-African ideological basis that has always underpinned what African unity is about: self-determination, a sense that we are stronger together as opposed to our individual nation states, which of course are not creations that we of our own making. These are sort of longer histories of colonialism and imperialism. The second most important thing in relation to the African Union that connects us back to this specific debate today is also the very strong feminist movement energy that went behind mobilizing around the questions of gender and women's rights. Many of you will now know that it was only a few years after that that the infamous Maputo Protocol came into force. And again, as the conversations of the African Union were happening, so was the debate about what does Africa mean for all its citizens, not what does Africa mean in a sort of very gender neutral perception of what it means to be a citizen on the continent and claim ownership of the continent. The third most important thing was the reclamation of Pan-Africanism. And I know that many of my comrades are often wary about the ways in which Pan-Africanism is used today in sort of very stripped of its political, deep political meaning, its deep possibilities for organizing, not only just on the African continent, but in the Black diaspora globally. But I think there was something in that moment in the refounding of the African Union that the spirit of the Nkrumahs and co came into quite strong focus. I would argue that we might have lost that a little bit, but I'm also seeing a sort of reemergence of those conversations and really requiring deeper engagements with what it means to imbue the African Union as a continental organization with a deep Pan-African ethos. That's not just a word we throw around, but something that we seize as a way in which we organize continentally, but also position ourselves in relation to the globe.
Thank you so much for that really excellent start to this discussion of the panel. And I think that it's really critical that you've highlighted the engagement of civil society. And that is something that we're going to want to pick up on later in the panel discussion. But also, I love this term, what does Africa mean for all its citizens, not just the men? And often when we think of the Pan-African movement, we think of these sort of big men of history. And as the Minister Dlamini-Zuma reminded us, that their role, the important contribution of women should not go forgotten. I think it's important also this idea of reclaiming Pan-Africanism and making and re-imbuing it with its radicalism, its political radicalism, I think is really critical. Ms. Mpeiwa, Mukondeleli, I'd like to bring you in here because as somebody who's working in the African Union Commission, and one of the major, shifts from the OAU to the AU was this emphasis on promoting women's participation in political processes. The minister highlighted how the national targets of involvement of women and participation of women in political institutions and parliament and women being elected to the executive are falling behind the targets that have been set. Can you say a bit more about how the AU is promoting women's participation in political processes on the continent? Before you get started, I just want to say to everyone who's online, we are going to be taking questions. So please feel free to put your questions and answers in the Q&A box. There is also a chat box, and I see there's quite a robust discussion going on there. So please feel free to put your questions in so that we can pick up on them once we move to the Q&A section. Mukondeleli, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mbete, for the question, but also for the kind introduction. I will build, of course, on the comments made by Dr. Okech. But before I do that, I wanted first to acknowledge the comment made by Dr. Magadla about me being a former student of Dr. Sally Matthews and also being part of Tax alumni. But I think more importantly, to abuse the platform and to thank the Honorable Minister, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, for what she has done for us as African women in international relations, diplomacy, but also in peace and security. At the personal level, I'm a beneficiary of a lot of the programs that she has spoken to today, including interventions at the then Foreign Ministry of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is now referred to as DERCO, where she introduced programs that sought to bring in young people into diplomacy and to train and groom us into diplomatic practice at the entry level. And this has contributed immensely to my career, but also my development as a diplomatic practitioner, working at the global level and now, of course, at the continental or on the continental stage. So just to acknowledge the contributions that the minister has made, and I think I speak for hundreds of us African women, but also African youth who have benefited from the interventions. So thank you very much, Minister, for that. Coming back to your question, I think it's an interesting reflection that we are making, because on the one hand, the AU represents a set of values and principles and a lot of aspirations as reflected in Agenda 2063 and so many 2063, but also several other policy instruments that are ultimately implemented at the national or country level. So that transference of ownership of the aspirations from the continental collective to the national implementation is, I think, where in many instances we fall short. And you heard also from the reflections that the minister made in terms of really the numbers of women participating at the highest level of decision-making in political processes is not particularly encouraging. And I think the reflection also extends increasingly to the lack of young people's participation in key decision-making processes generally across the continent, and something that should be of concern to all of us, because we, I think, are having an intergenerational gap or crisis where we don't have a bridging generation that links our previous leadership to the incoming or the younger leaders that should embody and take forward the initiatives that have been started by the leaders that we have currently on the continent. And this also reflects itself in different or other aspects and areas, including in the realm of peacemaking and conflict prevention, where you rely quite a lot on the influence of our older leaders, but also their moral high ground and their gravitas and convening power to help stem extension of conflict or its escalation into violence, which obviously has got dire consequences, especially for women and children across the continent. But I think through simple instruments like the election observation missions, the ACDEG, the policies that the AU has introduced, but also at the regional level, SADC, ECOWAS, and all the other regional economic communities have got a set of principles that guide democracy and its practice in most of our member states. But of greater concern, I think, to all of us has been this resurgence of unconstitutional changes of government coups that are often informed, of course, by social, economic, but increasingly security pressures that most or a lot of our governments are under. And of course, this is a growing concern given that it has spread across the entire continent or the 5 regions of the continent, with us seeing extremism in Mozambique. So I think we are at a crossroads where we need to reflect and see how how we can bridge the gap between institutions like the AU and the average African, and they are realizing that the democratic journey and experience is for all of us to contribute to, in as much as it is for all of us to enjoy. So I want the AU to the people and enhancing ownership of the institution by your average African. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And you've really highlighted a big issue of concern, which is those regional and all these unconstitutional changes of government, which are also gendered, right? It's such a, it's often done by the military or by the army in ways that are really harmful and damaging to the women in those countries. Of course, we also can't discount the role of foreign interference in all of these kinds of coups that we've seen in some parts of the continent. And what that means for the well-being of the women in those regions. I think also what you've raised around this lack of a bridging generation. As I was preparing for today, I found some research that says that 40% of the continent is younger than 15. The median age on the African continent is now 20. And we see that there is a huge disconnect between the people that make up the majority of the continent and the people that govern. And how do we work towards bridging that gap? Minister Dlamini-Zuma, I'd like to bring you back into the discussion here. You referred to it in your address, but I'd like us to just delve a bit deeper into assessing the AU's Women's Decade from 2010 to 2020. And, we had the misfortune that 2020 was then also the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, which made it really difficult to reflect on some of our milestones. But can you reflect a bit on how the AU Women's Decade has improved the quality of African women's lives, and how the AU is an arena that African women can look to towards achieving gender equality and substantive African integration? What are the mechanisms, do you think, that women can try to use within the AU in order to achieve some of those goals and targets that you were referring to?
Thank you. I think the Women's Decade has contributed to some movement, but as I said, not enough. But if we just look at the recent developments, the African, I think that's a very important development. And women themselves have organized. There is an organization now which is new, Women in Trade in Africa, who are trying to assist women who want to be part of the African free trade area and to take advantage of that. But also, if we look at, unfortunately, as you say, COVID has actually taken us in many ways because of the loss of jobs, but it also excellent of we don't want young girls to be married off. We want them to reach their full potential. So a lot of even heads of state took up that campaign as part of their presidential campaigns in some of the countries. And I think that was very important. And I hope that it will not just end with the decade, but will continue. The other area that brought to the fore the importance of women was when we, at the AU, we appointed a a special envoy for women in peace and security. So she is able to assist and to bring to the AU into sharp focus what is happening to women in those areas that are experiencing conflict. And I think that is important, because sometimes we just look at the wars and not look at what it means for women, because they are the ones who bear the biggest burden of conflict, women and children. So that special envoy was an important addition to the AU's work. The issue of the skills revolution, it may not have taken root to the extent we would like it, but if you look at the agriculture, for instance, the Decade for Women has actually encouraged some of the member states to assist women in agriculture, and also to rethink the issue of land. If you look at Ethiopia, for instance, days before, they had men tended to be the owner of the land. But now, if you are married, you own the land jointly, and if you divorce, you must also divide the land. And that in itself has also brought a new paradigm in terms of power relations in the family, because now the wife is not just the dispensable. You have to think twice, because they are going to lose half your land. So there are lots of things like that, I think, that sometimes we don't highlight, which are important. Of course, they are not uniform across the continent, but there are those pockets of things that have gone well, which I think we can learn from and try and replicate also in other countries. I don't know how much time I have.
No, that's, I think you've said so much. And I think what you just ended on, of all of these pockets of progress and of excellence through the continent, that we tend not to learn from what we've done well. We focus on what's gone badly. And I think that, emphasizing and highlighting all those areas of progress, like, the change of land ownership and tenure in Ethiopia, I think is really important. I also think that this highlighting of the women, of the Special Envoy for Women, Peace and Security, my PhD was in the UN. I researched the UN Security Council and South Africa's involvement in tenure on the council. And in so many areas, the African Union was far more progressive in terms of having women in involving women in conflict resolution, having women in peace delegations, far more than the UN community in general. And very often it was the African member states who were sort of dragging the other members of the Security Council along in being far more progressive on those issues. So thank you for that. You said a lot. And before we go to question and answer, I'd just like to come back to you, Dr. Okech, a bit more on the engagement of civil society, because as Minister Dlamini-Zuma said, there's this dominance of men in national governance structures, and so women's interests on the continent are usually and most often expressed outside of the state. It's the civil society organizations, it's the social movements, and one of the unique features of the AU's Constitutive Act and its architecture is how it explicitly institutionalizes civil society engagement. How do you think that in terms of the AU as an institution, how women and gender appear in the policies and the leadership and practices, but also I think most importantly, how in your experience has the AU engaged with women outside of formal state structures?
Thanks, Sithembile. Let me, I'm going to answer that, but I just wanted to pick up on a point that was raised earlier around unconstitutional change of governments. And I recall, because I was still living in Kenya at the time, this was right in the aftermath of Egypt and Tunisia. The African Union, held a series of events in Zanzibar and in Tunis around unconstitutional change of government. And what I found particularly interesting around that discussion was the push by many of the civil society actors who were present around an interrogation of what institutional change of government meant, particularly in the context of popular uprisings. And that while that particular framing within the African Union architecture was designed to guard against coups, its invocation in the context of popular rising was a bit misleading. Because if the power comes from the people and people are returning to the streets to say that the political and economic program that you have put in place is not in service of us, is that an unconstitutional change of government? Or is the power returning to where it has come from? And I think many countries have struggled with what popular uprisings have meant, particularly when the military has then stepped in and other actors to really usurp what have really begun as organic movements from citizens across many of these countries. And there is a question there for citizens around what it means to guard those democratic gains, particularly when you have been able to unseat at least the visible holder of power, because we know that the structures of power in a lot of this country go far much deeper than simply unseating the one person who happens to be president. But I think in the context of this debate of unconstitutional change of government, it has also then forced us to think about what it means for the demographic you're talking about in relation to young people. And the assumption that the role of young people is, of course, to go out into the streets. They're energetic. They're the ones who do not have jobs. They're the ones who make the demands. And then when it comes to the point of negotiating the spoils, then we say you wait your turn. And I think there's something for youth movements to learn from feminist movements who have always had to deal with this kind of issue where we make demands and questions around gender equality, or women are mobilized during periods of conflict because at that particular moment, all you need is labor. We are no longer debating around questions of the women's places in the home because that time we need everyone on the front. And the minute we're beginning to talk about power and the new constitution and how we ensure an equal society, you're reminded that you're hijacking the struggle and let us deal with much more important issues. And I think that the African Union space, because the AU is not the building, the AU is not the Heads of State Summit, the AU is its member states. And so all of the provisions that exist in policies have to find home in national policy frameworks and legal policy frameworks. And I think that's where the challenge comes, because even if we talk about the implementation, the full implementation of the Maputo Protocol, the provisions, for instance, around the Lagos Platform of Action and questions around health, for instance, the broader governance provisions that are within the African Union, security sector reform, all of these wonderful frameworks that have been developed at the African Union level. Its localization is where the problem arises. And that localization relies on two main things: money, because in order to implement these policies, governments need to put their money where their mouth is, which is to say that we're going to put the resources to ensure the full implementation of these questions. And secondly, the sort of opportunistic, as far as I'm concerned, return to, well, culturally, these things do not make meaning in our context, and that we shall take the bits and pieces that we find useful for our context and then, put reservations on other areas rather than fully embracing the frameworks as they have been envisioned continentally. I think that at an African Union level now, when we look at the Secretariat, in relation to gender, there is a big question again about money, where the significant reliance on funding for those programs coming from external donors. And now there is an opportunity here with the work that is being led by the Kagame team around funding for the African Union to also think quite robustly about what it means to fund our own work. Because I think when we are consistently reliant on foreign donors, to support very important initiatives on the African continent, then it sends a very strong message, because once that money is no longer existing, what does that mean, therefore, for our commitment to these issues? So the politics of money, I think, remains a very important question. And we know that when governments want to find money, they will find it. So I think this question about there's no resources internally for us to fund things, I find it a very dubious one, because when money needs to go somewhere, all of a sudden it appears. So for me, the political will, as far as I'm concerned, is about putting the resources where the commitments have been made. And that, I think, has been where the core struggle has been. A last point on civil society engagement. I think that while civil society has not waited, and this, I think, has been the beautiful thing, civil society has not waited for the African Union to engage it. It has indeed stepped in for a very serious engagement at a secretariat level, but also in terms of ensuring the implementation of Maputo Protocol or other protocols at a national level. The utilization of the African Court for strategic litigation, as far as I'm concerned, has been a very important symbol by civil society organizations saying, you have set up this court. If we're going to have debates around whether the ICC is the court we use or the African Court, then we will use the African Court. And we will try and push you to ensure that you're actually acknowledging the sovereignty and independence of the institutions that have been set up. So for me, that has been very beautiful to watch, to see how institutions such as ISLA have actively taken cases, to the African Court as part of setting precedent and testing the independence of our institutions.
Thank you so much. And I think that you highlight an important point there at the end around that, for civil society, you can't wait for yourself to be invited, that it's actually taking ownership of the institutions and using them as they were meant to. Big question around money, and I know that was an issue that Minister Dlamini-Zuma, when she was the chair of the AU Commission, about having countries pay their dues. That you can't just be waiting for the EU or whoever else to be funding issues and projects, that actually paying our dues as African nation states. I would now like to come to Mukondeleli before we go to the questions. I see there's so many questions in the chat, so I want us to have enough time to go through them all. We've seen the AU play a much more visible role in conflict prevention and democratic consolidation in the continent. We saw in the most recent elections in Zambia and Kenya, the AU really playing a big role in helping with those elections. Can you share some of the highlights of these engagements and tell us a bit more about what they've meant to women and youth that you've worked with?
Thank you very much. I'm going to try and buttress also, before I respond to your question, unfortunately, the points raised by Dr. Okesh around the politics of money. And of course, related to that, foreign interference, not just in our efforts to resolve conflict, but sometimes in brewing conflict and instigating and in many ways sustaining conflict on the African continent. And I think we at some point will need to have a discussion around the expense that we bear as Africa for the proxy wars that we host on our continent, and that have been protracted and have cost us exponentially in development, but also in human lives, including, of course, the sexual and gender-based violence aspects that women and children have to contend with. But also, just to say, a point was raised earlier on in the discussion about Pan-Africanism. And I think that increasingly we are seeing through the Commission, but also member states, a real commitment to or recommitment to African solutions to African problems. And this is exemplified even in the current engagement of the AU in trying to support conflict resolution in Ethiopia, where despite a lot of international pressure, the Commission, but also the member states have been quite firm in wanting a uniquely African nature to the efforts to resolve the peace and security challenges here. That being said, your question around democratic participation and the role of the AU in conflict prevention, especially around elections. We have had a good run over the last 8-10 months. The situation when we were engaging in Zambia was quite complicated and complex. There was a lot of political pressure for the regime to remain what it was, and of course, pressure also for change socially and otherwise. But our engagements were led both in Zambia, but also in Kenya by His Excellency, former President of Sierra Leone, Ernest Bai Koroma, and he managed the dynamics extremely well. Not just with the main parties that you see sitting around the table, but also the constituencies behind them that they represent, where often you have hardliners pulling things in the opposite direction of what you would want to see. But I think both in the case of Zambia and in Kenya, we have seen, despite challenges, questions, hurdles here and there, the integrity of electoral processes and the role of independent electoral bodies coming out in a more positive light. And I think despite the challenges that we saw, especially in Kenya with the contestation with the Supreme Court and all the mudslinging, it is good for democracy because it tests and strengthens systems, structures, processes, and also shows us where the gaps are and what to strengthen institutionally, not just for the country in question, but for the continent at large. And in some cases, I think also for the world. So the AU being able to play a role behind the scenes, just in terms of calling for calm, ensuring that supporters of the different parties remain peaceful, even in their expressions and manifestations around the electoral space, has been extremely important. But again, drawing back to the issue of intergenerational leadership, in Zambia, our engagements would not have been successful without the contribution of former President Banda, who then subsequently passed away. But his ability to convene former President Lungu and HH around the electoral period, but post-electoral, especially when the tensions were so high with the results being a bit delayed, was critical to having a smooth transition. And even the handshake that was televised internationally between the two who have really not seen eye to eye and have got deep-rooted issues between them was really brokered by African leadership. So with President Banda at the forefront in many ways, but President Kikwete also working with President Koroma to bring these leaders together and ensure that the transition is smooth and that they continue to work together. And without a figure like President Banda in most countries that we're working in, how do we facilitate and broker these engagements when we are so far removed from the local context? And this, I think, is something that we need to really reflect on, because whether we like it or not, there's some convening power that comes with being a former head of state that the average practitioner, even if you're a technical expert, you will not have. And that gravitas is something that really facilitates some of the engagements that we do and have really contributed to our successes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I see we've had a whole lot of discussion on the chat and some questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to read the questions out now, and I will say directly to which member of the panel that a question is directed. So we have a question here from Canon Joyce Nima, and it seems to be open to the whole panel, saying that while discussion on women empowerment rages the issue of women with disability is subsumed. We need affirmative action for women affected by disability. How and when can we include them in this debate? I'm going to allow any of the speakers to answer that one. And then a question here from Doreen and Gala. saying, and this is particularly directed to Minister Dlamini-Zuma, saying, what is the minister doing to manage conflict in South Africa, especially against other foreign brothers and sisters? I'm from Zimbabwe and a lot has been said. So yes, I think that those tensions in the country are something that's been top of mind for many people. Condoleezza, there's a question here from Khadija who asks, so she comments that great hopes were put on FemWise at its creation. Unfortunately, there's a kind of uncertainty concerning its future and of the role that African women could contribute in safeguarding peace on our continent. Could Mukondeleli and other speakers enlighten us about the future of FemWise Africa and the role of women in ensuring peace in different regions in Africa? And then, Dr. Dlamini-Zuma, there was a question, well, it was a comment actually from Jacqueline about the issues around sexual and reproductive health rights and reproductive justice, and how a woman's right to choose cannot be ignored. Could you comment a bit? We've spoken a lot around education and skills. We've spoken around economic empowerment, but really issues around healthcare and particularly sexual and reproductive health rights, given also with what's happening in the United States and how much of the continent's health systems are paid for by American organizations. Just some reflections from you about those issues would be really valuable. I think let's start with the minister and then we'll ask the other two speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just start with the first question about women living disability. I think that's an important aspect. In South Africa, I wouldn't say we're perfect, but at least we have decided a long time ago to also have quotas for people living with disability, whether it is in government departments, so that they also should have the quotas for employment, not just women, but all women. So there is a 2% quota for that. In some departments it's met, in some it's not. But also even in society, there are programs that look at women with disability. But I'll be the first one to say that may not be enough, that is not enough. But at least there is an effort. Maybe it was an omission to not put emphasis on that in the discussions this afternoon. Conflict between South Africans and other Africans. I think that we must look at this in this way. In South Africa, other Africans who come to South Africa, if they obey the law, they are legal, they are here legally, they really shouldn't be a problem, and most of the time there isn't a problem. But because they are from Zimbabwe, I'll talk specifically about Zimbabwe. You know, when I was at Home Affairs, there was a big problem around the Zimbabweans who were here and didn't have the right documents. We actually had a dispensation where we gave them a specified time to register and get the right documents. And a lot of them did, but some didn't. And then when we then asked, why did you not have the right documents in the first place? They then said that they weren't getting passports from Zimbabwe when they wanted to come here. So we had a joint committee that involved the Minister of Home Affairs of Zimbabwe and ourselves to say, how do we facilitate the movement of people between Zimbabwe and South Africa in a legal manner? Because that's really the crux of it. People must come in a legal manner. And if they are not, then they should. If they are refugees, then they must declare themselves. The law is very liberal in South Africa. They must declare themselves as refugees, and they must get the right papers. And of course, where there is conflict in a neighborhood, that is also has to be then resolved, and find what are the issues and try and resolve those issues. Having said that, there was also a question of sexual reproductive rights. I think it's very important. This is a very important aspect of women's health. Women must have the right to choose. In South Africa, we do have the law that allows that. At the AU, there were a lot of debates about this matter in terms of the right to choose and their reproductive rights. And like any other matter, it's a matter that is part of the struggle for women's rights. As I say, we're lucky here that we actually have a law that gives women that space. And I think it's important to also get women to be organized in terms of across political parties, across sectors, because when women are together on something that affects them as women, irrespective of politics or religion or whatever, they are more likely to succeed in what they are struggling for. And I think this is one matter that should unite women across all sectors of society. In South Africa, women used to die a lot from all sorts of things, including backstreet abortions and so on. And it used to be thousands and thousands of women who die. And we had to really say, as women, we're not going to allow this. And we were able to succeed, but it wasn't easy. That's one law which united even the religious leaders across all religions. You got Muslims working with Catholics around this matter, opposing it, but we managed to do it. So I completely agree that it must be part of the health of women and the part of the health system. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Minister. And I think that's, and thank you for those reflections on the struggle of ensuring the women's right to choose in South Africa. And I think it's going to be a long battle to keep preserving those rights, given this conservatism that we're seeing in different sectors of our society. Let me turn to you, Awino, with the questions I think that were directed towards you.
Thanks. Actually, no questions were directed towards me, but one does not waste a good opportunity. And I have a very good opportunity here with a minister from South Africa. And so I have to say this. Minister, do bear with me. So I studied in South Africa. I did my master's and my PhD in South Africa. So I've lived, and South Africa has been was a good home to me. South Africa, as we all know, benefited immensely from many African countries that supported the apartheid struggle. South Africa continues to benefit from the huge intellectual contributions of Africans who are working there in different capacities. South Africa remains the vanguard in the defense of Pan-Africanism, one of my most favorite, even though it might be politically incorrect to say so. South Africans is Thabo Mbeki, and his very clear Pan-Africanist stance and the role of the African continent. So it pains me quite a bit, when we witness what is happening to Africans in South Africa. Now, as an intellectual, I can offer all the kinds of analysis around questions of class, the socioeconomic inequalities that lead to a situation where the targets of this violence is on those most marginalized rather than the heart of capital, which is where that struggle should be based. But it also pains me that there isn't an opportunity here for us to really interrogate what borders mean across the African continent. And that if we're really going to be having a conversation about Pan-Africanism, then what do borders actually mean across the African continent? When we talk about the African passport and the free movement of people and goods, when we talk about legality of Africans moving across the African continent, what are we saying about our ability to move across each other's countries and really embody what Pan-Africanism means or African unity means outside of the constraints of visa regimes and what it means to be legal or illegal in a country. And that for me is a very separate matter from signing up to the social contract of when you're in somebody's home, then behave well. That is a very different matter, from how we move across borders in the African continent. And really, I think if the African Union at this particular moment takes seriously what Pan-Africanism means, then we must interrogate the question of migration and borders across the African continent. We must interrogate what the free movement of people and goods means for us on the African continent, because we cannot be waging the same battles in Africa that some of us have to wage when we are crossing to Europe and the US. So I didn't want to waste a good opportunity to send that message. South Africa has been good to me as an individual, but it's a country I've not been to in the last 10 years, simply because of the hoops that some of us have to jump through to get a visa, which I know you don't when you come to our dear country, Kenya. Now that's an issue for Honorable Ruto to deal with. But again, back to the central message of Pan-Africanism, borders, migration, and legality. I wanted to speak very briefly on the question of reproductive justice. And indeed, that's a very central question. Sithembile, as you point out, there's a broader wave of fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism in particular, that does not bode well, particularly around questions of reproductive justice. For some of us in the Eastern African region, this is something that we are watching particularly very closely, given the ways in which the state and the church are organizing in quite interesting ways, and the role of the church in particular in policy making and in politics is something that is worrying. There's a very big distinction between the importance of recognizing faith as an important part of how our communities engage with each other and how that crosses over and creates a situation in which we now enforce particular ideals and ideas around how people should govern and lead their lives. So this is something that indeed women's rights activists need to watch very keenly, because there's a convergence of actors globally around these sorts of questions. Their impact on the United Nations and other bilateral bodies is something that organizations such as AWID continue to track. They are well-resourced, well-organized, and really engaging quite proactively, even with some of our diplomats, around questions, particularly around on the edges of, the Commission of the Status of Women, on broader debates around the language of gender and gender equality. And this is a core area for concern. I think there's a tendency to often focus on the question of choice, yet there's something that comes before that, which is the debate around comprehensive sexuality education and really equipping and enabling broader conversations around sex, sexuality, bodily autonomy, and gender much more broadly in our societies, that is often being curtailed in quite interesting ways across our education system. You see it even here in Europe, you know, in terms of debates around comprehensive sexuality education in the UK, across France, and in other parts of the globe. So this is really a global conversation, and there's a convergence of actors and resources, and it's something that we need to watch quite carefully.
Thank you so much, Dr. Okech. Thank you. And I think that's important, you know, just sounding the bells at the end there, that this is a global movement against women, and that we do need to watch for it. Thank you. Mukondeleli, I'm going to come to you. There was a question directly around FemWise, which I think is really important. Can you? Yeah, I'm handing over to you.
Sure, certainly, thank you. But I also don't want to miss an opportunity. So let me be like Dr. Okech and address other issues first before we talk to the pertinent issues of FemWise. I used to work for the International Organization for Migration. So I am in some ways quite passionate and quite attached to the issue of migration as a topic, but also its implications for society development and so forth. But I am also South African and I go home from time to time. And while not holding brief for anybody, including the government, I think it's also necessary to address the other side of the discussion without in any way promoting or defending xenophobia. That is inexcusable. But I think the reality of the situation for South Africa as a country is that the socioeconomic pressures are enormous. The capacity of the state to respond to the demands of everybody living in South Africa, citizens and non-citizens alike, is reduced. I mean, you can look at it from a load shedding point of view, but also public infrastructure, roads, hospitals, and so forth, and the quality of services. So just to say that the conversation for me is always either or, and in many ways polarizing and puts people and issues as opposites and not necessarily a balanced one that looks at the issues in an objective way to seek or identify solutions. The reality of it is the push factors of migration are actually the root cause of the consequences that we end up addressing or debating around. And it still boils down ultimately to good governance and holding our governments to account so that we don't need to seek greener pastures in other areas, and we don't need to flee. And I think this conversation needs to be taken to every platform available, including the corridors of the African Union Commission. In as much as we always say we are not a supranational body, we do have the platform to engage member states on some of the responsibilities that they all need to take in order to protect Africans as a collective, but also for the future of Africa and our development. So just to say that there are a lot of dynamics, and I think we need to be to rise to a point where we start having objective, futuristic, solutions-driven conversations around migration and the bad consequences of irregular migration, but also socioeconomic pressures that we see in issues like xenophobia. That having been said, the questions raised around FemWise, I think are in many ways issues that require a family meeting between the commission and the members of FemWise. But I'll say here and now, because the questions have been raised and they are legitimate, the network has about 480 members registered to date. In terms of deployability, because the network is supposed to promote participation and facilitate participation of African women in track 1, high-level mediation and conflict prevention processes, our fitness for purpose is not what it should be. And this forces us, because of the increased interest in the network and peace and security generally on the continent, and the diversity of the continent, which I think is also something that as a South African, I took for granted before I started working across the continent, just in terms of the needs, the demands, and the levels of development and so forth. All of that requires us to recalibrate and decentralize and basically restructure the whole network. This has been communicated in various platforms. And of course, I understand the anxiety, the uncertainty and so forth, but we also need to give the change and the reform process space to happen. There's a lot of national and regional appetite increasingly to establish structures or networks for women to participate in political processes and peace and security. But we cannot all be in the same room at the same time. We are trying to create other platforms for all of us to contribute where our talents, experiences, knowledge, and so forth is most relevant and will be most impactful. That could be the national level, regional level, or the continental level. So we are building the network, basically dismantling the roof and rebuilding from the bottom up, building national structures first, then working with the regional economic communities to build regional chapters, which will then contribute or create the continental structure. So we will get continental FEMWISE members from the regional economic communities and no longer directly from the ground. But I see just from this discussion, because I haven't been in contact with the network for some time, that we need to have a family meeting. So I will commit to organizing for the FEMWISE members here, a general assembly virtually first, and then we'll have a physical one with limited participation so that we can try and thrash out some of the concerns and see how we can address some of the gray areas and uncertainty and really work together through the transition to have a better network with better access and better representation. But the deployments are still ongoing, and we'll keep on trying to find opportunities for our members to enhance their skills and contribute to peace and security efforts on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for that commitment. It's always amazing, these platforms. I know we've gone way over time, but it's just incredible to have such an incredible group of African women just speaking freely. And you know, you can see the big activity in the chat. And it's just been really, really great. So thank you for indulging us. I'd like to give Minister Dlamini-Zuma a moment just to say any final words to respond to some of what's been said before I then hand over to Dr. Magadla to close for us.
Thank you very much. I just want to say something to this very important issue of movement of people. I think, one, the AU Constitutive Act hopes that one day Africa will be integrated, and we could be completely integrated, and so we will not be having this discussion of borders. But before that happens, the AU produced an African Union passport. And when you use the African Union passport, you don't need a visa to move freely. But because the AU does not have the population register of countries, it then gave that responsibility to the countries to issue the African passport. And it said that you issue an African passport. If it's issued in South Africa, it will be an AU passport, but with South Africa showing that the issuing country was South Africa. How many countries have utilized that opportunity? And us as citizens, what have we said to our governments about that opportunity? So I think the developments in Africa need all of us. It needs the government, it needs the AU, but it needs active citizens who hold their governments accountable, who also know what has been offered in the AU, what the countries have signed up to, and therefore, why is it not happening in my country? So the AU has assisted, even through the African passport. I have the privilege of using that African passport, And it was a great pleasure to use that African passport moving around African countries. So I think we must also utilize what is there, because the movement of people and goods is important for the integration, is important for trade, is important for integrating Africans. So I just wanted to raise that point, because if we do follow what has happened as citizens, we can also contribute to a faster integration of Africa. Maybe in the interest of time, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Minister, for that intervention. And thank you to both of our panelists, Mukondeleli Mpeiwa from the African Union and Dr. Wino Okech, who joined us from SOAS. I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Mapokwana to close for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sther. Thank you, colleagues. And thank you to Minister Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, Mukondeleli, or Dr. Okech, for gracing us with your presence today. Certainly, you can see the heat of the discussion when these kinds of issues are raised. And thank you, Sther, for facilitating such a balanced, beautiful, but rejuvenating conversation. And obviously, it is beautiful to talk about institutions like this one. What do they mean for the younger generation, who are facing precarity on daily basis? It is nice sometimes to reflect and see the values, if they still hold for us, and how can we take the conversation forward. Obviously, this is happening in the midst of our oceans full of bodies of Africans running away from the continent and trying to get a better life. So we always have to be conscious of what these things mean for our own futures, our own economies, and the continued precarity of young people in this continent. So thank you very much for this conversation. And obviously, this conversation would never be able to happen without the leaders that continue to support this collaboration between us, Rhodes, Nelson Mandela University, UCT, UP, University of Pretoria, and also UNISA. So to Professor Sizwe Mabizela, the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Monapula Mapasela, the DVC, Professor Innocent Msindo, the Humanities Dean. And also here in our presence was Professor Pamela Maseko, who's also Humanities Dean here at Mandela, Professor Nomalanga Mkhize, the Senior Director of School at Social Sciences and Government Studies here at Mandela. Thank you, colleagues, for always making sure that you support these kinds of collaborations. And to my fellow organizing team, the leader, Dr. Siphokazi Magadla, who was ushering us, Dr. Sithembile Mbete, who is also our facilitator today from Political Sciences at UP, Dr. Atambile Masola from UCT, Dr. Gavaza Malulega from UCT as well. So thank you, colleagues, for the vision and also stimulating plan for this beautiful evening. Without the constant communication with the colleagues at the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, we would not be able to have a minister today here. So Mandi Sambele, Matom Flongo, Nelly Soa Chilome, Vukani Mtinzo, Boyani Mpasha, Lekadima Leso, Lungi, Mchadi, thank you so much. We appreciate you facilitating the communication. The students from Rhodes, Nelson Mandela, and University of Cape Town, I hope this platform will provide a sort of a template on how to begin to work together, build communities so that we can take Africa to a different level. Some of the students who were working with us in organizing this event is our chair, Tandokazi Silosini, Kanya Benz Ncamashe, Nopumelo Babeli, Busang Senne, Panashe Mufukari, Hauchelo Mukumbeli, Nigel Machia, Offense Make, Okuhle Pokwana, and Siphokazi Tawu. Without Sibulele Duba, who is an administrator, Wendy Adams, and also Charmaine Avery, who are all administrators who held us together through this platform. Thank you so much, colleagues. And we are hoping that we'll have this conversation in a different format, even if it's physical, in the near future. Please make sure that you keep coming, and also we'll send the invites to all our mailing list for our next conversation. Thank you so much, colleagues. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.